good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you might be. We're delighted to have you all here with us for the Women in Public Policy Program's weekly seminar. Thank you for joining us. I am Iris Bonnet. I am the co-director of the Women in Public Policy Program and a professor here at the school. We're delighted to have Professor Anna Weeks joining us today. She's going to be presenting her research on corporate board quotas and gender equality policies in the workplace. Professor Weeks is an assistant professor in comparative politics at the University of Bath, and that's where she's joining us from. Before that, she actually was here at Harvard as a fellow in the government department, but also, and that's why we had some little hello going on here before, as a fellow of the Women in Public Policy Program. And in fact, just before we entered the room today, Anna told me that this still is her favorite seminar. So we're delighted to have you back, Anna, and thank you for holding us in such good memory. Anna's research focuses on gender and politics, political representation, and political parties. Her current work that you will also see part of today is focusing on the policy impacts of gender quota laws in democracies, the effect of corporate board quotas on workplace equity policies, and the inclusion of women in populist radical right parties. Her work has been published in some of the leading journals of her discipline, such as Comparative Political Studies, European Political Science Review, etc. I also want to welcome WAP's podcast community, which has downloaded our seminar almost 60,000 times now. We're so pleased to have this lasting community, the broad-reaching impact that we have of all of you. So thank you for listening to us, and thank you for the work that all of you also do in advancing gender equity. The plan for today is for our speaker to present for the first 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes maybe, and then to have the rest of the time available for questions. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. Those who have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted to ask your question out loud. We do ask that any audience questions are relatively brief, be on topic, and be posted in the form of a question so that we can allow for many of you to participate. In fact, I know Anna just told me she's actually eager to hear your comments and reflections. My colleague Katie Umber will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar. And with that, I am very happy to turn the mic over to Anna. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for having me here back to this fantastic seminar. Let me just go ahead and share screen with you all so I can show a few slides. So the project that I'm going to be talking about today is a collaboration with my fantastic co-author, Audrey Latura, who's also part of the Harvard community, finishing up her PhD, I think next month, actually defending in the government department at Harvard. And it's this project is about the effects of corporate board quotas on company attention to gender equality issues in the workplace. So it's a bit of a departure for me as a political scientist. I normally study parties and governments and not firms. So I'm excited to hear from those of you in other disciplines who do this kind of work more often. But in this case, we're moving the focus from parties and governments to examining the broader impacts of public policies that are meant to promote gender equality. And I want to start by noting that women's inequality was, recently called the greatest human rights challenge of our time by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. In his remarks last year, he made the point that gender power gaps persist across countries within various facets of our lives, from societal norms and culture to politics to inside corporations. And gender gaps are especially large and intractable in the most powerful leadership roles in society, like members of parliament, boards of directors, prime ministers, presidents, and CEOs. So as a remedy, gender quotas requiring women to be included in politics as candidates for political parties, or in the case of corporations, in leadership positions such as boards of directors, have really increased rapidly in recent decades. And quotas were first seen in politics, in political parties and electoral laws before states began passing laws requiring quotas for private sector corporate boards. And quotas are arguably more effective than any other measure at closing gender power gaps, which is why some have called quotas a fast track to gender equality. As you can see here, 12 countries have now passed laws requiring gender quotas for the boards of corporate, for private listed companies. And Norway is often seen as the first mover, the first country to pass a hard quota with strict enforcement mechanisms. And then many other countries have followed suit, especially, but not only in Western Europe. So this is an area of legislation that's really growing rapidly. For example, last month, legislation was tabled in the Netherlands that would expand its quota and impose harsher sanctions for non-compliance, including annulling board appointments if they don't meet the quota. So our question is, does this matter beyond numbers of women on the board? Is it possible that quotas can change corporate incentives to address gender equality issues in the company? Can they give firms added reasons to focus or even compete on policies like mentorship and training programs for women in management, like childcare, parental leave, flexible working, the gender pay gap, and so on? In other words, we want to know whether gender quotas can lead to a cultural shift within companies whereby companies become more attuned to gender equality, not just at the top, but its antecedent reasons, at all levels throughout the firm. So the literature on corporate board quotas shows that quotas do achieve their primary objective of increasing the share of women on boards, although the specific rules of the quota, the threshold that's required, the target for women, and how it's enforced, the enforcement mechanisms do condition the effects, those matter. And then a large literature also focuses on the effect of corporate board quotas on firms' financial performance. And this has produced somewhat mixed findings, although increasingly that literature is showing that there's no negative effects on financial performance, and even positive effects in some contexts, some countries like Italy, for example. And now other lines of literature are now emerging, which focus on whether quotas have a trickle-down effect on women in management. And again, here the findings are a little bit mixed, but overall it seems there's not yet a lot of evidence that quotas do increase women in management at other levels throughout the firm. But in most cases, we're looking at fairly short-term effects so far. Now, at the same time, there's kind of a parallel literature in political science, research that looks at the causes and consequences of political gender quota laws, which require political parties to include women as candidates. And of particular interest for our project is the recent line of research, which shows that quotas increase political party attention to gender equality in party manifestos, so parties' agendas. And that quotas also increase spending and policy outcomes related to women's interests. So healthcare spending, as in the case of Clayton and Zetterberg's global study of gender quotas, and work-family policies that encourage women's employment, like shared parental leave in the case of my own work in the context of economically advanced OECD democracies. So we are aiming to contribute to this literature by offering an initial exploration of whether quotas for corporate boards can also impact attention to women's interests within the context of the firm. And so far, no research looks at this question. We argue that it matters because company attention to gender equality in their policies, from training and mentorship to paid leave for caring, childcare provision or subsidies, and tracking and monitoring the gender pay gap and gender gaps in leadership, they ought to precede change in outcomes like women in management positions and the gender pay gap. So company attention to gender equality in their policies is a first step, which should come before all the other changes to gender gaps in leadership and pay. Our main argument is that quotas are also intended to change culture. So the success of passing a quota law and the associated debate about implementing it shows corporate leaders that gender equality is now an important issue that they ought to care about. This quote on the slide is from an interview with the co-sponsor of the Italian gender quota law, conservative politician Lella Golfo. And after the quota law was passed, she very much stated that part of the intent of the quota was to change culture, to get companies to take on these broader issues related to women's discrimination in the labor market. And we see the same type of arguments being used more recently in the context of the Dutch quota proposed legislation that was tabled last month, whereby the Director for Social Affairs at the Confederation of Netherlands Industry and Employers recently said that, in addition to increasing women's opportunities at the top, cultural changes such as more accessible childcare are necessary to achieve real changes to diversity. So our main expectation is that quotas might have this spillover effect, that companies ought to respond to this legislation and to the attention to gender equality that's raised by this legislation by increasing their attention to equality issues more broadly throughout the firm. And we're going to measure this through public-facing annual and sustainability reports. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a minute. So our analysis in this paper mainly focuses on the effects of corporate board quotas, but we're also interested in understanding what drives these effects. What's the mechanism? And we have two main ideas about what links gender quotas to change in company attention to equality. And perhaps the first thing you might think of is identity, is that if there's an effect of corporate board quotas, it would be driven by increased numbers of women on the board. Particularly when women aren't just tokens, but when there's a substantial number of women constituting what's often called a critical mass, then women might have the power to shift corporate attention to issues that they care about. Now, this theory of women's critical mass leading to policy changes is often borne out in the literature from politics, where we see that women in office, in parliaments, and in government can lead to policy changes in the direction of women's interests. However, this idea also rests on a couple of assumptions that might not hold in the context of corporate boards. First, not all women are feminists. I mean, this is certainly true of politics as well. And the literature so far about corporate boards often doesn't find a difference in the behavior of men and women. So in fact, some research even finds that having a woman on top can be bad for other women, the so-called queen bee effect. It might be the case that actually critical actors, so having specific feminist women on boards who care about these issues, is more important than critical mass or sheer numbers of women. Secondly, there's no consensus on the extent to which boards are actually involved or ought to be involved in directing these kind of policies within firms. So HR and human capital risk are often considered a management issue, and so the board sometimes doesn't involve itself in it. What's more, if women aren't on relevant strategic board level committees, they may not have an opportunity to create this kind of change to policies that promote gender equality. So theoretically, women on the board might matter to workplace policies and to company attention to these issues, but we also note that there are some significant challenges to the assumptions that underlie this argument. So the second main explanation, the second main way that quotas might affect company attention to equality issues is through increased awareness and public pressure that's associated with the law itself. Even though these explanations aren't mutually exclusive, it could be both of these things. But the main idea behind this theory is that, well, policies can change public opinion. They can change mass attitudes or elite attitudes. In the political science literature, this is called a policy feedback effect. And for example, some research shows that legalizing same-sex marriage actually changed attitudes on same-sex marriage. Policies can signal new social norms, and then people are then more likely to shift their opinions to be consistent with the law. In a similar way, we think that quota laws signal that gender equality is a priority, and they may be able to put this issue on companies' radars in a new way. This might be related to increased awareness. So maybe companies just didn't, charitably speaking, maybe companies just didn't know. Maybe they just didn't understand that women's equality is a concern. So increased awareness raising could be why we see this kind of spillover, or it might be due to public pressure, particularly if, for example, the media are now reporting on gender equality within company leadership and what firms are doing about this. So here I'm showing on the slide an example of this in the case of Italy, where media attention to women on boards of directors increases significantly in 2011 when a corporate board quota law is adopted. So the red line here is showing the coverage of Italian news that mentions the words women and boards of directors. And the blue line is showing within those news, the number of news articles that mention women in boards of directors, what percent of these, what number of these mention a quota law, mention the quota law. So this shows that attention increased significantly in 2011, clearly related to the quota law, and it hasn't returned to pre-quota levels since the quota law was passed. It's actually double. The media coverage is double what it was before the quota law. So arguably now the media have a greater interest in this topic. Taking a more cynical view, it's also the case that companies might choose to increase attention due to a fear of backlash or being left behind. So if it's true that companies think, well, maybe there's more likely to be more spotlight, increased spotlight on the issue of gender equality now, they may become concerned about their reputation among investors, among potential employees, the labor market, or the public, if they're seen to be laggards on this issue. So for the sake of our analysis, our quantitative analysis in this paper, we can't test the spillover theory directly. We don't have access to, for example, the kinds of public opinion data that we would need to test this change over time, or elite opinion data, really. I mean, ideally, we want to have access to those internal conversations within firms that would allow us to confirm why they made the decisions that we did. Unfortunately, we don't have access to this, but we can test for whether the impact is driven by women on boards. And so because we think actually it was probably more likely to be a spillover effect than necessarily driven by women on boards, we expect to see that the effect of quotas on company attention to equality issues is not conditioned or changed by women on boards, that companies will shift attention towards these issues regardless of how many more women on boards are coming in after the quota. Okay, so then the last part of our theory looks at which issues should corporate board quotas affect. We expect that companies are going to be most likely to increase attention to women in leadership throughout the firm, not just boards. And that's because quotas are essentially aiming to fix a block in the leadership pipeline for women. So this is the issue that's most closely related to women on boards. We might see this come up, for example, in increased leadership training, mentorship programs, networking events, monitoring and evaluation of women in management at various levels, new dashboards, and so on. However, if companies are really serious about tackling gender gaps and inequality, we would also expect them to start paying more attention to the gender pay gap, which is very much related to the gender gap in leadership. So there may be, again, additional monitoring there, evaluation of pay gaps, transparency initiatives, and so on. And then also attention to work-family issues. And that's because a lot of research now makes clear that motherhood is one of the biggest factors explaining gender pay and leadership gaps. So this is when women start working fewer hours compared to men, and management work typically requires longer hours and pays more. So help reconciling work and family might look like childcare facilities on site or subsidies, flexible working, remote working, paid leave, not just for mothers, but also shared parental leave and for fathers. On the other hand, another very important gendered issue is sexual harassment and discrimination. We actually don't expect quotas to impact firms' attention to this issue at all. And that's because this is a hugely important issue, but firms are very unlikely to mention it at all in these kinds of reports. Even acknowledging this issue, particularly before 2017 and the rise of the Me Too movement, might seem risky for companies. So we think that this isn't going to encourage them to increase attention to this issue, which overall they would rather just avoid. So this is just a summary of the main argument and expectations. We expect quotas to impact company attention, increase company attention to gender equality. We think it's probably driven by increased awareness and public pressure rather than women on boards. We'll also look at that with the qualitative analysis as well. We have a little bit to say about the mechanism there. And we expect firms to increase attention, especially to leadership gaps, but also pay gap and family care related issues. Now, to test this argument, we use data from annual reports, corporate annual reports and corporate social responsibility or sustainability reports before and after a quota law was passed in Italy in 2011. And we compare them to annual reports in a control country, in a country that didn't get a quota law, which is Greece, over the same time So this slide just shows some pictures of the annual and sustainability reports, some of these that we collect. These all have to be downloaded from individual company websites, so it's a significant data collection effort. And we focus on the highest revenue listed companies in each country. And so before I get into the specifics about the data and methods, I just want to share a little bit about these cases, why we focus on Italy and Greece. So Italy passed a quota law in 2011. And it wasn't really expected, especially before March of 2011, when it was first debated seriously in Parliament. It was a bipartisan bill. It was co-sponsored by women across the main center-left and the center-right parties in Italy, Alessia Mosca of the Democratic Party, center-left, and Lega Golfo from the People of Freedom Party, which is a right-wing party at the time headed up by Silvio Berlusconi. And Mosca said in describing this law, we needed a shock to the system. Now, the law required 20% women on boards from the first renewal after August 2012, and then 33%, a third, starting with the second board renewal. In Italy, boards hold these elections every 3 years. So this was a stepwise approach, a smaller target for the first board renewal, and then it was supposed to be in place for only 3 board renewals, so only 9 years. But it's since been extended in legislation in 2019, and the threshold is now increased to 40%. Companies also face pretty tough progressive sanctions if they refuse to comply with this legislation, including fines of up to €1 million and annulment of the board. So we chose to focus on Italy because this is a country with relatively large gender gaps in employment. Compared to its peers in Western Europe, fewer women are working, lower levels of women in leadership as well. Before the quota law in Italy in 2010, the share of women on boards of listed companies was 6%. It's also a state with relatively little spending on family policies compared to its peers. So that means that companies actually can play a big role in providing some of these policies because the state doesn't provide as much. They can provide childcare, particularly under age 3, where coverage is lacking in Italy. They can top up paid leave, particularly outside of maternity-only leave, which is the way that Italy's leave system is structured, still really focused on the mother. So they can provide meaningful support in this way. And this is a big difference between Italy and, for example, Norway, which a lot of the scholarship focuses on because Norway does provide much more in terms of family and support policies. So here's just some news coverage of the passage of the corporate board quota law in 2011 in Italy, in one of the Italian newspapers with the headline, a third of women on boards, the gender quotas are law, and also highlighting the bipartisan nature of this bill, that it was really driven through Parliament by women across parties. So we compare Italy to the case of Greece, which is similar in many respects in terms of women's employment, women on boards, low family policy spending, and so on. And we actually use a statistical matching program to do this, to find a match for Italy. So we know that it really is the most similar country available on these criteria. And we think Greece makes good sense, given that these countries are often compared as similar types of Mediterranean welfare states in other literature as well. And importantly, we do see the trends in women on boards are very similar before the quota in Greece. In Greek companies, women made up 6% of women on boards in 2010, so very similar to Italy's 5%. But then if you fast forward to 2019, you see this dramatic increase in Italy, where women are now 36% of boards, compared to a much more gradual change in Greece, where women are now 9%. So absent a quota for the boards of listed companies, private listed companies in Greece, we don't see the same extent of change to women on boards. And then I just also want to note that you might think of some other potential control cases that might be a better fit, particularly Spain, but actually some of these countries also have corporate board quota laws, so they aren't actually, we can't use them as a control in this case. Okay, so this is a mixed method study. We use both a quantitative and qualitative analysis of these annual reports. And we use a difference in differences approach. So this is implemented in the quantitative analysis via a two-way fixed effects model, where we're including both company and year fixed effects. And the basic idea is that we're measuring the difference before versus after in the treated country, Italy, which gets the quota in 2011, compared to the control country of Greece, which does not. And we expect trends in company attention to gender equality to start increasing in Italy after that 2011 quota, but not in Greece, which didn't have the similar quota for private listed firms. The data we use come from annual and sustainability reports, which are all downloaded from company websites. They represent, we have almost 1,000 of these reports, 962 company year observations, pretty equally spread over the 2 countries. This represents 96 unique companies, 52 companies in Italy and 44 in Greece, an average of 10 reports per company. And to analyze these reports, we developed, we use an automated text analysis program, and we develop a dictionary of gender equality words. And then we develop subcategories devoted to these 4 categories I mentioned of the gender leadership gap, the gender pay gap, family care, and sexual harassment and discrimination. So here is a word cloud, which just shows you what some of these words are, what some of these words look like in our dictionary. The size of the words doesn't mean anything here. But it just gives you an indication of what some of these words might look like. Actually, some of them are phrases, so they've ended up like we don't search just for gap, but gender gap. We also undertake several methods to avoid using words if they're not in a context where we think is related to employee benefits. So for example, in these annual reports, a lot of companies talk about charity work. And in that context, women and children comes up a lot. So we don't search for children, we search for childcare, for example, because we have a reasonable belief that childcare will be related to an employee benefit, but maybe children will be used also in the context of charity work or donations. We also take out instances of, for example, men and women, and we use various other methods to try and make sure we're measuring what we're hoping to measure with these dictionaries. Now, the main dependent variable, the outcome we care about, is the share of all the words in the report that's devoted to gender equality issues or these subcategories. And then the main independent variable is the quota law. So this is the main explanatory variable we care about. It's a binary variable that equals 1 after the quota law is adopted in Italy in 2011. And in the Italian reports, we also collect all the names of the board members, and we use a gender API software to predict the gender of all the board members using the first names. So from this, we derive a measure of the sum and the share of women on boards in Italy. We also control for report type. So, and our rule about this is that we preference sustainability or corporate social responsibility reports. Companies do this differently. Some only produce 1 big report for the annual report and sustainability. Some produce 2 separate reports. So when there's 2, we will preference a sustainability report, but we also check for balance on this across countries, and we control for it to make sure any differences in report type are not driving our findings. And as you might expect, companies on average spend very little of the report talking about gender equality. So it's a fraction of a % of a report's words. And most of this is made up of topics related to family and work balance, followed by leadership and pay gaps, and then least of all, sexual harassment and discrimination. This sounds like a fraction of a % sounds insignificant, but it can actually translate into many pages of a report discussing various aspects of gender equality. So just to give you an example of this, from the banking financial company Unicredit's report 2011, about 1/3% of the overall report's words are devoted to gender equality. However, in the actual report, that corresponds to 7 paragraphs under the section of promoting gender balance. Okay, so we argue that these reports actually have meaningful content related to gender equality. So now getting to the results. So here's a descriptive plot of attention to gender equality issues before and after a quota law in Italy, which is the blue line, and Greece in red. Before and so you see that there's a break in 2011 where the quota law is adopted. And before that break, you see that Italy and Greece look very similar. The lines are flat, fairly indistinguishable. And then after the quota law, the average attention to gender equality in Italian reports jumps up a little bit and starts to increase. And the slope then increases over time in that blue line. In Greece, on the other hand, that line stays flat or looks to even be slightly decreasing over time. So this shows a change in attention, a diverging attention to gender equality issues in these 2 countries, and an increase in attention in Italy in line with our expectations. Now, this is a similar plot showing change just looking at attention to the gender gap in leadership. So specifically words related to women in management and getting women into leadership positions in the company, mentoring, training programs, and so on. And we see similar trends in this case, although a bigger jump in attention to these issues in Italy with the blue line. And again, the slope is increasing over time. So before the quota law, we see really no difference between these two countries, and afterwards, a jump in Italy and increasing divergence between attention to gender gaps in leadership in Italy and Greece. Now, concerning the effects of quotas on women on boards, we also find, as others have as well, that the Italian quota was effective at increasing women on boards significantly. So this is the share of women on boards in our sample, in our data, and change starts to pick up in 2012, in line with the law's requirements. And the Italian companies in our sample do end up meeting that quota of a third by the end of our time period, 2017. So that's just some descriptive data, but I'm not going to show the main regression tables, although I can certainly do that in the Q&A if anyone's interested, but I'm going to return to the main hypotheses and summarize the results of those models here. Again, they include both company and year fixed effects. The main independent variable is the quota law. We also control for report type, and the dependent variable is the share of reports devoted to gender equality and in these subcategories. Okay, so first we do find, in line with the plot that I showed you, that a quota law is associated with a significant increase in overall attention to gender equality issues. And that coefficient size corresponds to a 50% increase in attention to these issues from before to after a quota law was adopted. We also find that, a quota law does increase the number and share of women on boards, but that this doesn't mediate the effects of a quota. In other words, the interaction between the quota and either the number or the share of women on boards was never significant for any of either the overall attention to gender equality or any of these other subcategories. So this means the effect of the quota on company attention to equality is independent of the number and share of women on boards. Companies are increasing their attention to these issues regardless, of how much the share of women increases after the quota law. We find a large and positive effect of a quota law on gender gaps in leadership, an 80% increase from pre to post quota adoption. Also, we find a positive effect on both pay gap and family care, but these don't reach the standard level of significance of 5%, so they're significant at the 10% level only. The p-value for family care is very close, it's 0.06. So, we think it's suggestive, and the size of the effects is in some cases large. For the pay gap, it's a 90% increase in attention, but again, only significant at the 10% level. So finally, in line with our expectations, we don't find any evidence that quotas increase company attention to sexual harassment or discrimination. Companies, by and large, are just not talking about this very much. It's the topic out of all of these issues that companies are least likely to talk about in their reports. Although, again, our data ends in 2017, so maybe this has changed in more recent times. So these results are robust for controlling for the type of report, and we also do several checks in the appendix to check the parallel trends assumption. So we want to see if there's evidence that there were any pre-trends. So was it the case that in Italy, attention to these issues was already increasing before the quota law? I mean, that would indicate it's not actually the quota law, but something else in Italy was increasing. Was causing companies to increase their attention to this issue. We find no evidence of this, so we run models that include lags and leads, and none of those leads in the run-up to the quota law are significant. So we only see significant changes from 2011 onwards. We also look at only the period before the EU passed a directive requiring certain types of sustainability reporting, just in the case that maybe countries transpose this directive differently, and that could also affect our results. Again, our results are robust to these additional models. Okay, so that's the quantitative findings. Now we wanted to understand, is this just talk? Is it just that companies are now making space in their reports in abstract terms, or are they actually making meaningful policy changes to address gender inequality? So in order to understand this, we had to read the reports ourselves. And so we hand-coded a subset of reports from each country. So 3 years before the quota law in Italy and 3 years after in both Italy and Greece. We chose 10 companies. in each of these countries. And we looked for and we read all the content related to gender equality, and we focused on the largest revenue firms in both countries. Now, the qualitative analysis finds, in line with the quantitative results, that in Italy, companies started increasing attention, especially to gender gaps in leadership, but also to work-family policies. We found this was the case even from the 2011 reports, and these reports are typically, they come out at the start of 2012. So this is before companies would have had a chance to renew their boards and to add more women. They would sometimes even mention the quota law as an incentive to further action, such as the example here from the electricity and gas company Enel. So they mentioned, starting from the incentive offered by the Italian law issued in July of 2011, on gender diversity, it's envisaged to structure training courses, as well as promoting these issues inside and outside the company. We also found that several companies say that they're planning to exceed the quota, either in the targets required, the threshold required, or before they need to legally comply with the quota. They're going to exceed those targets before they need to. Some of them also said they're going to be implementing the quota in foreign subsidiaries where there's no legal requirement to do so. So that's an example, again, from the energy company Eni in 2013 report. In terms of work-family policies, we also found that a good chunk of our qualitative sample, 2 of the 10 Italian companies were planning to increase, said they are increasing childcare benefits, facilities or subsidies. 3 of them increased parental leave, and another 3 include additional benefits related to flexible working. So here's just an example of one of the biggest shifts that we saw in our qualitative data after the quota law. So this is the banking financial company UniCredit, and this is their 2011, it's a page out of their 2011 report. And in 2011, they created a new gender balance program to identify activities that will lead to the professional advancement of women. So that's the blue box out that you can see here. And so they say in the report that this was launched at the end of 2011. It involves measurement of the number of women executives being recruited and promoted throughout the group, mentoring women, evaluating programs that offer flexible working, and so on. They do actually report on these gender balance targets in subsequent reports. So this other page is from their 2013 sustainability report. The figure you see in blue there is women's presence in different levels of management throughout the firm. And they say it's from the gender balance KPI dashboard. So this suggests to us that, the targets weren't just window dressing, and that actually maybe this isn't just sort of boilerplate text, but companies say that they are, developing new policies. So because companies are already responding to the quota right after its adoption, even before adding more women, and because they sometimes specifically mention the quota as an incentive for their other initiatives, we think that this qualitative evidence reinforces the theory of a spillover effect due to public pressure or due to changing social norms. It seems to be influencing companies to increase their attention to gender equality issues within the firm. Now, within Greece, we didn't see evidence of this sort of change, again, in line with our quantitative findings. Instead, we tended to see the same text being repeated year after year. There's one exception of a company in Greece that adopted a new, very progressive, gender-neutral parental leave policy, the state-owned public power company. However, most companies weren't increasing their attention to these issues, and there specifically, there wasn't any focus on women's leadership training or mentorship programs, which we see often in Italy. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. Our reading of these reports suggests that companies are going beyond what they did before in Italy, but not in Greece. Our main findings are that corporate board quotas increase attention to gender equality in reporting, specifically issues related to the gender gap in leadership, but we do also find some suggestive findings related to work-family policies and the gender pay gap. The size of the effect corresponds to a 50% increase in reporting and gender equality overall, and an 80% increase when it comes to gender gaps in leadership. So that's a sizable effect, which can easily translate into several paragraphs of text in one of these corporate responsibility reports. Our qualitative reading of reports suggests that companies are making some real policy changes in response to the quota law. They're talking about new training and mentorship programs. They're talking about new work-family policies. These are all observed to increase in Italy after the quota law was adopted, and we see much less of this in Greece. But I note that actually in July of last year, in 2020, Greece adopted a quota for private listed companies. So companies are now going to be required to include 25% women on their boards. So it would be very interesting actually to extend our data collection and see going forward, do we also see Greek companies start to talk more about these issues, since they will now be obliged to increase women's participation in leadership, and potentially there could be more public attention to these issues as well. We think the practical implication of this research is that public policies could have important impacts on gender equality in the private sector. That quotas, by signaling the value of gender equality and increasing public pressure on firms to deal with these issues, could be one of many tools in putting women's equality on the radar for firms. They're not a panacea. For example, they don't impact firm attention to sexual harassment and discrimination at all. And we have, several questions on the extent to which these are initiatives that are valued by men and women in the firm. I'll get to that in just a second. But on the whole, we think this evidence is encouraging, and advocates of corporate board quotas, like the co-sponsors of the Italian law, often specifically say they hope the quota will lead to a culture shift. And so, this is some evidence that maybe there are these intermediary effects that could lead to future changes in levels in women in management throughout the firm. Our research also opens up a lot of other questions, which we hope that future research can look into. I think most pressing this question of how exactly does the quota lead to policy change? We believe that it's due to this spillover effect because we don't see that effects are driven by women on boards, and we also observe companies making changes, before they have a chance to renew their boards. But without insider knowledge, it's just very difficult to know. We need to know who makes the decisions, who implements them, and their motivations. Are they impacted by public pressure, by backlash, or could critical actors on the board be making a difference? So one senior executive at a top Italian firm told us that having women on the board is something, but having a woman dedicated to this topic is another thing. So it'd be very interesting in the future to interview executives within firms to shed more light on this. So that is all for me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this great presentation. The floor is open for questions, and Katie will moderate them.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand by either going to participants and clicking the blue raise hand button. For some versions of Zoom, it's under the reactions tab is the raise hand, so whatever works for you there. And also, if for any reason you have trouble with your microphone, feel free to share the chat, your question in the chat. And I see we have two questions off the bat. David, I'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question and give Professor Weeks a chance to answer it. And then we'll go to Anne.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thanks so much, Anna, for the presentation. So I just had a quick question related to a point you made at the beginning about trying to examine mechanisms. And I was wondering if you have access to data of Italian firms that would have been affected by the reform, but only in principle, but in practice not, because they already met the quota. And so if the idea is that by increasing female representation in the board, you should have this effect, then perhaps those firms would not show as strong of a result as you see in general, because there wouldn't be any increase in representation for those firms that were already meeting the quota.
Yeah, so I should go ahead and answer now. So this is a great idea to think about. We certainly could subset the data to see which firms already met the quota, or maybe were even closer to meeting the quota. I think that would provide more evidence against the kind of mechanism for women on boards, but I'm not sure it would provide definitive evidence for the spillover mechanism, because if the mechanism is due to increasing public pressure and social norms, then we would expect it to affect all companies, right? So So that's the part that we can't measure directly, if that makes sense. But I like this idea. It's a great thought to think about. Can we subgroup the firms to see if there's any heterogeneity in effects? I mean, I suspect not, because the interactions were never significant, but we could certainly look at that. So thank you for the suggestion.
Wonderful. And then Anne, I'll unmute you now.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering about the timing of the gender quota law with other things that were going on at the same time in Europe, and mainly the development of the Lehman Sisters argument that started in 2009. And on the graphs, one of your motivational graphs that you showed, it seemed that the effect and attention on these gender equality issues in Italy started, of course, before the gender quota law. And so I was wondering if you can kind of isolate this Lehman Sisters types of arguments effect, because I'm thinking that maybe for an unknown reason, it picked up more in Italy than in Greece. And maybe it's kind of just this general attention to these issues that are driving some of your results.
That's a great point. So we've thought about the Italian context with regards, because there was another big social movement that happened around the same time, the If Not Now When movement, which is a political movement in Italy. And so with that movement, we've actually gone into the media analysis and done a little bit of work to measure to what extent in these articles that talk about women on boards or women in business, are they talking about this movement? And we found that there was very little of that, and it was much more likely they're talking about the quota law. So for us, that's reassuring, because it suggests that the public pressure comes from the law and its requirements rather than from this movement. But we haven't looked at this Lehman Sisters idea, so that's a great point, and we can certainly look at that. My theory about the 2009 was that actually that's because the quota law was debated for the first time. It was proposed for the first time in that year, but it's so tricky with one country and observational data to get a handle on these things. So I appreciate your suggestion. I'll definitely look into that.
Great, thank you so much for your question. I see a question now also came through in the chat from Jillian, and I'll read it out loud so that those who are watching later can hear the question. Curious about what you saw in the political discussion on the topic leading up to the implementation of this law. What were the key themes or language used by the left and by right-leaning parties? Especially interested in this as this work seems to be bipartisan.
That's a great question. I haven't done this analysis of the content analysis of the themes that left and right-wing parties use, but my interpretation is that the conservative politician who worked to help drive this law through, Lella Golfo, even entered parliament partially to pass this bill. So she was a businesswoman, and I think she still heads up an organization for women in business in Italy, and that actually quotas in Italy have been a bipartisan effort also in politics. So there've been proposals on the right for a political quota law in Italy as well. So it's one issue that women seem to work together on in Italy, also in other countries. Belgium, for example, had a bipartisan passage of a quota law. So yeah, it can be sometimes an issue that unites women across parties. That would be really interesting additional research question to look at the language around and the themes around passage of this bill.
Great, thank you. And I see Julie has her hand raised. Julie, I'll ask you to unmute now. Let's see, for some reason I'm having trouble hearing you. Anna, can you hear her?
No.
Okay. Let's see, you're unmuted. Try speaking again, Julie. No, I'm so sorry. It must be something with your mic.
I'll try and come back. I'll put it
There we go. There you are.
Okay.
There you are. It was the magic sigh, so go for it. Oh, okay. I think we can hear you now though, Julie. Well, she's going to pop it in the chat. In that case, I'll go ahead and let's take a question from Mark, and then we can go take Julie's question in the chat.
now? Yeah. Hi, Anna. So congratulations for the study and for the presentation. So my question is regarding the policy changes in your qualitative analysis. So now you are examining if companies are offering new policies, but we don't know about the use. So I'm wondering if in future studies as you are suggesting, if you are planning, although it's quite difficult, but if you are planning to try to examine the use, because there is all this lovely research about flexibility stigma. So that one thing is that we are offering these policies, but maybe the culture is so strong that employees don't feel, I don't know, that they don't have enough legitimacy to use these work family policies. So my question is if you are considering examining the use of these programs and policies.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Absolutely, I would want to do this because again, it's unclear to me how do companies come up with these initiatives. A lot of times they talk about focus groups within the firm and they talk about consulting, new mothers for, what would help them get back on track or something like this. I think your own work, Mark, points to all these, great points about there's these real social pressures within firms. Recently experienced also, personally, various family members. It's particularly hard for men to access these. I also wonder what happens if you have all these new sort of training programs for women. Is there any backlash among men in the firm who feel like, we're not getting access to any of these programs? So I think you're absolutely right. If we really want to understand the impacts of downstream effects of these gender equality policies and what companies are actually doing, we need to look at this micro level outcomes for employees. So I would love to do that. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll circle back to Julie's question that she's put in the chat, which is in California, they adopted quotas that resulted in women being overboarded, by which she means a small number of women serving on a ton of different boards that might impact spillover effects. Have you looked into that in your study?
No, I haven't looked into this. There may be a way to identify this in the study. I'm certain because we have the individual names. What I know about the types who are elected in the context of Italy is that it looks like they were. I know so in terms of their qualifications, they seem to be just as qualified. But maybe at least some of the other research from Norway, maybe they would have been younger. Less likely to have sort of CEO experience. I don't know about this. I haven't seen any evidence about this question of overboarded in the Italian context. But if the effect isn't coming from women anyway, if it's coming from the social pressure, if companies are now feeling like, okay, gender equality is an issue that increasingly the market's expecting us to compete on, and the law and maybe additional public pressure for media attention is reinforcing this, then I'm not sure that having women serving on multiple boards would affect the spillover effects, if that makes sense. So I haven't thought about that. Thank you for the suggestion. I'm not sure it would get at the spillover effects.
Thank you so much. And I see Norma has her hand raised. Norma, I'll ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Good morning. I was wondering whether this experience you told us about or any other you might have known have provided with information with respect how does appointing more women on boards translate in favor of women's rights in the workplace or gender equality? Because I'm from Mexico and here we don't have that quota law, but we have the gender parity law in Congress. And we're now the 5th place in the world in women's representations in Congress, but this hasn't quite translated in favor of women's rights. We haven't seen that yet. So I know it might be quite soon to know about this, but maybe you have some information on this or any interventions that might help to actually that appointing more women on boards would actually have an impact in favor of women's rights. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question and a great point. Certainly looking at politics, it's not even women in parliament, it's women in government that seem to matter quite a lot. And then even then, I think this point about critical actors rather than critical mass is really important. So having feminist women in positions of power matters. But it's not always the case that sheer numbers of women are going to somehow act in women's interests. In my own work, looking at political gender quotas, I find that quotas have an effect, particularly on those issues that aren't already well defined by political parties, that are kind of off the left-right dimension. And that I think is because parties otherwise kind of prefer to ignore these issues. So work family policies, I argue, are one of them. But maybe violence against women is another one. So when you have women who have a common interest across parties in these issues, like the example of gender quotas, for example, like women across parties in Italy work together to drive these through, then maybe that's an issue where we would expect to see more change. So I mean, I think you're totally right. And on the context of boards, it also happens because there are board committees. And if you're not on the right sort of strategic board committee, you may not be in as powerful of a position to make changes that you want to see. So it's not just a sheer numbers point, it's about ideologies also and about positions of power.
I think we're out of time, right, Katie, if I look at our clock, unfortunately. But please join me in thanking Professor Weeks for this amazing presentation. If I may, Anna, just say one thing at the end. I think it's super interesting work, and I think that question of critical actors versus critical mass is a really big one. And like some of the other people who ask questions, in my mind, I'm also going through the idea of, what else could you think of in terms of really showing the mechanism here?
Yeah.
Meaning, for example, in some countries, but I don't know, Italy, the law only applied to big companies, but not to small companies, only to companies of a certain size. Yeah. Was that relevant in Italy too? Could you have a counterfactual there in other companies which didn't have to comply? Or could you have a counterfactual in politics where it didn't apply, or NGOs, or some sort of, because I do like your general, it resonates with me that there's something about the law being passed that then led to media attention and lots of changes. And so I think the more you can establish the mechanism, the more powerful, but super interesting. So thank you. With apologies that I had to sneak in a comment here.
Thank you very much, excellent.
But with that, I thank everyone for attending. I thank Professor Weeks for this presentation.